Well, glad we tested that. Hello? Can you hear me now? Fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me back to the Cove Book Festival. Enjoyed it very much last year. Very keen to come back this year, and in particular to interview someone who I've met many times over the years, and was the person behind the soundtrack, I think, of my student days. Like so many people, I think Raintown meant so much. 35 years since that debut album. There was a... Definitely, did you hear that there? Wow. A singer-songwriter of great acclaim, 7 million album sales since then, a radio presenter, award-winning radio presenter, and now, thanks to this book, also a published author. A very warm welcome to Ricky Ross. So, Ricky, I mean, tell us a bit about how this book came about, because if we kind of go back to 2020, that was supposed to be a really big year for you, for the band, for everything. You launched City of Love. You were about to undertake this massive, biggest tour that you'd ever done, and then, of course, like for all of us, everything stopped.
Yeah, everything stopped, yeah. So, you can hear me, can you? Yeah. So, I'd been writing towards this album, City of Love, and I started writing a song, which I didn't even know if it was a song, but it was a story, really, and it became a song called On Love, and it was really a little, just potted little memory thing. And the initial spark of it was really writing about my grandfather. And when I was young, my grandparents looked after me. My mum was a teacher, and she went back to teaching. I think when I was maybe about 3 or something like that. And so someone needed to look after me during the day. It was my grandparents, and I was very close to them. And I loved my grandfather. He was a great character. He was kind of opposite in many ways to my father, though they were very good friends as well. But I thought, I put 2 lines about him in this song, and I thought, 2 lines for such a big character? That seems almost more of an insult than actually writing about him properly. So I went off and just started writing about them, and as you say, one thing led to another, and suddenly there was time, and I would just jot down things on my phone. I would just jot down little things I wanted to write about. I thought, this is quite therapeutic. It's good fun, and I suppose in the early days, I just spoke to a friend of mine who was a writer. A couple of people. I let my wife read things, I think, because I always do. I always say that Lorraine has been my editor when it comes to songs as well. And suddenly all this time opened up, and I thought, well, maybe now's the time to write a bit more.
And it sounds like it was a very similar process to how you would write music, how you would be writing songs, and at the same time you're using this lockdown period to create a new album. So you've got the short stories album as well.
Yeah. I think actually, to be honest with you, the book had sort of probably taken more shape by the time the album came around. But there were similar themes. There was my mum was. I knew she was dying because she had that. She was 92 at this point, and she had been diagnosed with cancer and had decided, I think very wisely, all of us thought, not to have any surgery or anything. So we knew that her health was failing. So these themes were there, and I started to reflect on that on the album as well. So there's a little bit of crossover between things, and then on the record there's definitely a song about the kind of hopes of what you're going to do when you get out of all this, because none of us knew at the time. I mean, that was the thing. None of us knew when it was all going to, or if it was going to end, and how it was going to end, and how different it would be. So it was, and I really hate saying, it was a creative time for me, because for some people it was just a terrible, terrible time. And I think for all of us probably in this room, none of us would ever wish to go back there again, and being separated from families and so on. And my big regrets at that time, one of which is that my sister and I would take turns, different members of the family, seeing my mum every day, and I thought, all that time, I didn't hug her, because we were told not to, and obviously you didn't want to do these things, but I thought, what harm would it have done,
I suppose, and it's interesting as well when you talk about the title of it, that it's walking back home. Walking becomes quite a theme for you, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Particularly in lockdown, there's all that walking.
Yes.
and just kind of, you know, it's a period of almost like marking time, isn't it?
Yeah,
And gathering things,
Yeah, yes.
and kind of looking back,
Yes.
so that you can then move forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wondered if there is a little bit of the earlier part of the book that you can read to us, just to give us a sense of, because I think what's really interesting about having, you know, known all your songs and the narratives that go into your songs all these years, it was just really interesting to see it built out and to get more of an understanding of where you actually came from and where Ricky Ross before Deacon Blue came from.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I been saying to the audience, I've been out on tour recently, is that when I grew up, it was a kind of funny situation because I grew up in the Christian Brethren, where my parents were Christian Brethren. If you grow up in a fundamentalist evangelical family, it really is your world. It's your community, and it wasn't as oppressive as that can sometimes sound. It was just lots of love and lots of community. But, and the big but was, we didn't have a record player. Now, I don't think that wasn't actually in the rules. I think it was just by luck. But there wasn't a huge priority to have a record player. My grandfather, fun enough, who was also maybe obviously stricter than us, they did have a record player. But there was no record player in my house. So there was no big collection of the Beatles and all that kind of stuff until much later. And I was about 8 or 9 when we got one. So a lot of the music that I heard was live. It was like music in the church. So this is really a story about music, how I came to music, and also relationship with my mum. So it probably answers a few of these things. So often people, this is in the church, were coaxed into singing who weren't necessarily best qualified. Some singers were better than others, and some, though past their best, still had something that drew me in. There would be solos, duos, a trio or two, and even a quartet who did barbershop harmonies to selections from the Golden Bells hymnary. It kept things interesting. Occasionally, the younger generation would be let loose on a song they'd heard by the Sally Army beat combo, the Joy Strings, and a guitar with a hand-woven strap would be faintly strummed. One day, a young fellow even accompanied himself on a Gibson SG Electric plugged into a real amplifier by a curly lead. He wasn't asked back. The moments I enjoyed most were the occasional solos by Lily MacArthur. Lily was a grandmother figure who'd been brought along by one of the stalwarts of the congregation. I enjoyed Lily as I detected in her voice an otherness that suggested she'd performed solo, but in slightly less refined company. There was a hint of showbiz vibrato, pointing towards years spent singing more worldly songs, and perhaps cooing and sighing at crooners of a different tradition. Lily's was a starker performance, and there was an ever-creeping likelihood that the whole thing might just topple over at some point in the third verse. It gave her recital the element of danger, and I identified and loved the uncertainty in her voice. In a world where no question was without an answer, Lily's voice was a thing of wonder. I never got involved in performing music at that age, except for one experience in my boyhood that has been seared into my family memory. My teacher entered me into a piano festival in Arbroath. My mother had to take me on the train there, and it meant taking a day off school. I prepared for the performance by learning the piece prescribed off by heart, but had been cautioned to look as if I was still reading it from the sheet music. Inevitably, halfway through the performance, I didn't know whether I was reading or remembering, and did neither. There was what seemed to my nervous mother an endless pause while I retraced my steps before I picked up where I left off. None of this was overly traumatic for me, and the adjudicator offered me consolation for having managed to complete the performance. For my mother, however, it was a nightmare from which she never fully recovered. No such festivals were entered again, much to my relief and my sister Anne's, for the rest of her life. My mum only ever came to see me play once. Although my own children find this fact a slight aberration, for my mother and me, it was a tacit agreement that was comfortable for both of us. I felt more relaxed knowing she was elsewhere, and she found plenty to occupy her without spending more time where she really didn't want to be. It served us both well for a good 40 years, until she died in 2020. In our final days, all of this came together in a strange and beautiful way. Her hearing gone and only able to enjoy tiny pieces of food, mainly soup or ice cream, we managed to comfort her by singing old hymns together, the ones we knew from the old days. Amazing grace, precious memories, the Lord's my shepherd, how great thou art, softly and tenderly. Then a chorus we must have sung so many times on a Friday night at the Bible band with my father conducting us, a hymn of hope for the unknown, the afterlife, the place where we trust all tears will be wiped away. Away far beyond Jordan, we'll meet in that beautiful land. If you get there before I do, look out for me, for I'm coming too. And finally, I realized it was this music, always there at the beginning, that brought us together at the end.
And it is really lovely. It's also really clear right from the start, as you say in the book, that you didn't envisage yourself as the lead singer in a hugely successful band. You just wanted to be a songwriter. That's what you started first and foremost as.
Yeah. Well, you know, Michael Mara, who's a huge influence on me, and also I think really probably a whole generation of people, certainly for those of us from Dundee. Michael always said he didn't want his name in lights, he wanted his name in brackets. Mm-hmm. And there was something magical about the brackets, because if you remember 45s and albums as well, there was always the title of the song, how long it lasted, and then there was these names. And I remember driving in Dundee at one point, and my dad saying to me, you know, Burt Bacharach, you know, he's the guy. Because my dad was a bit more of the world. He'd had a little bit more life about him. So he kind of did know a little bit about pop music and stuff. And he said to me, you know, Burt Bacharach, he's the man. And at first, I just even loved the name. I didn't know who he was. I just loved that name. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like a really great idea. And the idea that Paul McCartney and John Lennon, you know, got in a room and wrote songs. And there's a lovely liner notes in the back of Hard Day's Night. I don't know if, for some reason, I borrowed a copy and never gave it back. I had a Beatles album for someone at school. And I love the liner notes at the back where it said the boys, you know, it was always the boys. The boys were playing in Paris, and they had a grand piano moved into the Georges V Hotel so they could write the songs for the next album. And there was just something about that. I thought, I loved the idea that you kind of closed the curtains or locked the door and you shut yourself away and you wrote a song, and maybe then it came out later. So it always caught, you know, it just took hold of my imagination, I guess.
And songs will travel far
Yeah.
more than even a very, very successful band can do. They go to so many more people, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they end up in strange places. And I remember I was a kind of real radio kid, you know, when I was, and one of the great things of the radio was you're always looking for pop music late at night. You know, you're always doing that. And even in the early 80s, I remember I don't know why, but I was just going along the dial, and I heard this, what must have been coming from a Scandinavian radio station, and they were playing the Blue Nile. It was like, this must be 1984 or something like that, and I thought, wow, that's exciting, because you're within a whisper of trying to do that yourself. You're trying to get songs, that you start recording songs. You think, oh, that'd be brilliant to be played on a foreign radio. And of course, that happened eventually, which was amazing.
Yeah, I was going to say Raintown and Tinseltown in the Rain become those kind of great songs of that era. Tell us a little bit more about Glasgow, because you mentioned Michael Mara, and obviously, like yourself, a Dundonian, but yet then becomes associated with Mother Glasgow and has such a kind of understanding of it.
Yeah.
When did Glasgow become such a inspiration on your work and such a kind of focus on what you were writing?
I think because partly the reason I moved from Dundee to Glasgow was really to make music. A friend of mine was putting a band together, and I was going to get a teaching job, and the two things sort of came together. And I sort of got immersed in Glasgow. I had pals that lived through here, and I think I fell in love with it at a distance before, and I'd always really been taken with Glasgow. Glasgow's one of these places, and I was trying to say this to people last night in Belfast. Belfast is similar kind of place in that you can drive into it and you think, you know, what is there? You obviously know the bit of the history. And Glasgow's the same, you know, you might drive through it and you go, on a day like this, you think, you know, what's all the fuss about? But you stay there for a couple of days. And I did a classic this morning. I did the taxi from the airport, you know, and the guy was just like, it was like a stand-up routine all the way home, you know. I'm Charlie for Govan, by the way, you know. I was like, okay, yeah. And I was like, I was a bit hungover, and I was thinking, you know, I would just, I could pay a tip just to shut up, but he's not going to do that, you know. So it's just that, it's that kind of, it's personality, it's character, and there's something that will never let you get too carried away with yourself about things. But there's just a human spirit, and I think cities breed that. The thing that makes London a great city as well, it's just that ability that people know they've got to get on. You can't, you know, you've got to somehow manage through life with all these people around you. And I think something about that about Glasgow, and I think maybe teaching in Maryhill as I was teaching, I sort of got immersed in that, the culture, and also one of the things we were doing a lot at the time was we had a brilliant head teacher at the time who was an English teacher who was the boss at the school and encouraged us to enjoy and celebrate local writing as well. So, you know, people like Willie McIlvanney and so on were people that I was reading, I guess, and seeing Glasgow from that perspective.
And obviously Oscar Mazzaroli's photos
Yes.
as well, another kind
Yes.
of image that
Yes.
you kind of
Yeah.
take on board too.
Yeah, someone gave me, very early on, I think a friend of mine gave me this book of photographs. And there was a book, I don't know if you remember, there was a book published around that time by what my kids when I was teaching in Maryhill used to call the Third Eye Clinic. There was
I'd hate to see the patients in there.
there was a book published by the Third Eye Centre, I think, called Noise and Smoky Breath, which was poems and photographs, people like Liz Lochhead and so on. And I think some of Oscar's photographs were in that, in very small print. And then eventually I got a bigger edition of some Oscar's work. And of course, eventually, a good friend of mine introduced me to Oscar himself.
And there's a lovely moment you're talking about the taxi driver and that kind of banter that you get back from depicting Glasgow
Yeah.
so beautifully in your songs. There's a particular incident that I love when you were rehearsing in 2014, I think, for Commonwealth Games
yes.
concert, when there's a particular song that takes you back to Dignity.
Oh, is this the one in the city square when
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So the very people that you wrote the song about, the Bin Men,
Yes.
want to hear you sing it.
Yeah. Oh, do you want me to tell that? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. But it wasn't actually the Commonwealth Games. But we were. In fact, I did a gig the other night in Cork, a solo gig, and it's the coldest gig I've ever done in my life. It was actually so. They had blow heaters on, but halfway through the gig, a friend, Hannah, who was supporting us, she came on to do a song with me, and she brought me a hot drink. When I was saying that, this is actually colder than the Hogmanay gig. So sometimes we used to get Hogmanay gigs. So we did our gig in Hogmanay in George Square when the city had money to spend on these kind of things. And it was one of these really cold Hogmanays. It was really cold. And so you had to go and do a sound check in the afternoon. And the council workers, who were all kind of bin guys, were detailed to go and just chip the ice off the pavements because it was going to be unsafe that night. So they were all doing this. Now, sound checks for us is what you want to do is the song that you know least well. If you're doing anything different, maybe, you know, and especially if it's a sound check in a public space, you want to do it quite quickly and get it over with, but just make sure that everyone can hear each other. And these guys are chipping the thing off the floor, and he's just in front of the stage, and he goes, "Ricky, do Dignity." And I thought to myself, I don't think we've ever done that, because we never needed to do it at a sound check. I said, you know what, let's do it, let's do Dignity, you know? So there we were, playing the song in the context, you know, it's suddenly become incarnate in this sort of moment. And it was brilliant. And there's a video of that moment, and there's just a guy leaning on a barrier a few hundred yards away. They're watching, and for some reason, he must be filming it on his phone, and he's got the whole thing down, and he just goes like that. Fucking brilliant.
No, it's an absolutely brilliant moment. This is you know, it's not, as I'm sure people are aware when they're buying it, it's not your classic celebrity memoir. It's not full of stories.
If you read the Amazon reviews, you'll find that out.
Yeah, it's not. And actually, I think that's what is lovely about it. There's one bit that particularly made me laugh, which is the moment where you all, as a band, are in the company of Bruce Springsteen, and you're kind of running away, aren't you? You're just so wary about meeting your idol and knowing what to say, which I find fascinating and also really, really funny, given this is at the height of your success, when you're on every TV programme, you're on every radio station, you're one of the most famous groups in the world, and here you are, so I say, no, you ask them, no, you ask them, no, we can't do this, let's go away. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, basically, we'd played in New York. We didn't really have any career in America, but we did have in '89, we have a couple of tours, and we ended up in New York at the Bottom Line Club, which is kind of a funny story itself, because we got there and our voices were, we didn't look after our voice. Lorraine and I didn't look after our voices the way we should have done. But when we got there, discovered that at the Bottom Line, you play an early show and then you do it all again later on. And we'd done these two shows, and our publicist at the time that worked for CBS Records at the time was also Bruce Springsteen's publicist, Marilyn Laverty, she's a great character. And she said to us, John Landau, who's Springsteen's manager, is having a party in Long Island. He was at the gig. He's having a party, or his wife's having a 40th birthday party, and they've invited you down, as people do, you know, like people you don't know. It doesn't really happen in Scotland. So my Lorraine was there with me. Obviously, we were in New York, and her brother and sister-in-law were coming over to the gig, and they were going to stay on for a few days. They were bigger Springsteen fans than I am, even. So of course they were quite excited to go to this thing. So we went to the party, and one thing led to another. We ended up speaking to Bruce. I gave him advice on his band. I thought, this has gone too far. And then Lorraine hit it off very well with Patty, his wife, and she came out and said, it was quite a long drive from Manhattan out to the Hamptons, as it was. And when we got back to the hotel, and he said, now, Patty has invited, I didn't tell John and Lindsay, but Patty has invited us to a barbecue in New Jersey on Thursday. And I was about to say something, and she said, and by the way, we're not going. And by the way, you're telling them. So I had the job of phoning the house and saying, you know that thing, we're going to go up to Canada or somewhere, we're going to go elsewhere, just kind of making things up. But yeah, we couldn't cope with it.
And do you look back on that and think,
no, I actually met him subsequently. No, I met him subsequently. And funnily enough, I love Randy Newman, for example, and Mark Mackey is a good friend of ours who puts Randy's gigs on at the Queen's Hall one night, and he said, oh, do you want to come back and say hi to him? I said, no, I don't. I really don't, because what if he's not, you know, and why would he, you know? Anyway, subsequently did meet him very, very briefly, partly to introduce my pal to him, and he was, of course, he was lovely. But no, I'm very happy not.
It's like, don't meet your heroes. You talk about it as well with Nancy Griffiths, who's another, you know, the late Nancy Griffiths, a great singer-songwriter. Yeah. I love her work, but I would be, I think, like you, a bit scared to meet her. And what would I say to her, you know? Yeah.
Well, she's scary. She was scary as well. She was great, but Nancy could be kind of a piece of work as well, my goodness. But yeah, I ended up writing a song with her, which was quite an interesting experience. But yeah, I think the thing is that thing about going back to the 45s or the brackets, that's such a magical thing. It's such a lovely thing to hold on to that you don't really want to lose that. And I do meet a lot of artists through my kind of radio show and so on, and they're usually lovely. But you know, it's nice to have ones that you just keep their picture on the wall, you know. Mm-hmm.
We'll come back to the radio show in a moment. The one other sort of little discomfort with celebrity that made me laugh quite a lot was in the description that you have of the 1993 Spanish TV show.
Yes.
In which you were basically, I don't know if you want to read a wee bit of it, because it is really, really funny. I love the notion of you being sort of dragged along.
You'll have to remind me of the page.
You're on page 178. 178. Chapter 20.
Yeah, this is Pum Pum Pum. Pum Pum Pum. Whenever someone ever says to you, do you want to join in Pum Pum Pum? Always say no.
And this is the reason that you'll never see Ricky on I'm a Celebrity.
Yeah. I told a friend about this, about this story, and he said, Yeah, there's actually a show in a TV show in Germany called It's Fritz. He said, at least he didn't do that one. The Proclaimers did that one. That involves Fritz himself joining in a big guitar solo. Imagine it's 1993 and you're at home in Spain watching your favourite Saturday night variety show on television. It's Ant and Dec meets the Generation Game and Noel's House Party on ice. There's music, comedy, dancing, and a grand finale. I imagine by now you'll be used to this part. You'll know the plimsoll-wearing host with the tuxedo and the designer stubble, and you'll also recognise his younger, glamorous female co-presenter. I'd imagine the 16-strong line of Brazilian dancing girls won't cause you much surprise either. As you look along the line, however, a small cloud might cross your consciousness as you see an uncomfortable-looking, pale, 30-something guy trying to keep up with what has now become a conga. That 30-something guy is me. It seems that when asked in broken English if I would be happy to join in with pum 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 that normally ends the show, I had unwittingly volunteered for ritual humiliation on a grand scale, live on Spain's biggest TV network. It was TV, I should have known.
Which I guess takes us neatly to radio and to another strand to your career, because obviously for quite a few years now you've been presenting another country and you do other programmes besides. And did that grow out of your visits to Nashville? How did that come about?
Actually, I'll be really honest, it grew out with me wanting to be on the radio. It was as simple as, I always loved the radio. And there was a great producer who you'll remember, Stuart Cruikshank. Stuart Cruikshank was a heroic BBC producer, now gone, very sadly, but he was a real champion, not actually of our music, more of Scottish independent music, and real, encourager of people, but was such a lovely guy, just a really great guy. And I was in doing something, on the other side of the microphone being interviewed, and I said, I would quite, love to do something. I don't know, I'd like to do something about music on the radio or something like that. I said something, and he said, well, I'll leave that with me, And about a few months later, he phoned up and he said, listen, Ian Anderson, who's obviously at that time had every night on the radio, had a great show, still does a couple of nights a week, and he said, he's going off on holiday. Would you come in and sit on the show? And I was terrible. I was a nervous wreck. But for some reason, they asked me back. And then another producer sort of commissioned a show which was going to be very vaguely called American Tunes, and it was a small series. And the two things really had... And then actually Ian went off, the controller of BBC in Scotland at that time said, look, everyone's going to have a summer holiday. I don't think any of the presenters wanted to do this, so we can try some new people out. And for 6 weeks, I was on late night radio. And none of that really went particularly well because it was a bit unfocused. But for some reason, they commissioned the other show, and then it changed producer. And when it came back, they said, actually, we want to make it a country music programme. So I met a young producer who'd come up from London called Richard Murdoch. This is in 2008. He came up from London from Radio 1, and we met in the canteen. I said, do you know anything about country music? He said, no. I said, well, neither do I. Well, let's just do it that way, So let's not try and kid on. But we both really admired it. And of course, it's so sad, but Rab Noakes, who passed away a couple of weeks, he'd cleared the road for this, because he produced and really brought to life this amazing program called Brand New Country. And it was really following on from that. And for a while, it was in the same time slot on a Friday night as well. So people like Brian Burnett, who'd presented it, and so on, we're very grateful to him, but especially to Rab as well,
And what is lovely about it, and the same was true of Rab's programme, is how much you are able to share with listeners as someone who's a songwriter, who knows songs, and it doesn't matter if you don't necessarily know who every single person is. Yeah. If you find something, you share it. Yeah. And I think that's what's really nice about it.
Yeah, and to be honest, I hate things that are exclusive. I hate things that you feel you've got to be in a club or something like that. So I think it should be. Rab said their great mantra was, it's for people who think they don't like country music. And someone once wrote to us and said, close your eyes and you wouldn't even know it was country. And I think that's right. And Rab had a lovely phrase. If you get a chance, fans thought, I think it's well worth listening to. Last week on the show, we put a 2-hour special of the 2 different times we'd had Rab on the show as an artist, and then one time just picking songs. And he said, our thing was, it wasn't just country music, but it was places and records where country music had made its presence felt. And I thought it was a lovely phrase, because that's true, because there's so much. If you go back to Elvis Presley, if you go back to Roy Orbison, and lots of people, if you go back to lots of soul music, you know, I was finding an Al Green covering Chris Christopherson the other day for something I want to play. Where country music has made its presence felt is such a lovely, vital idea, and that's kind of where we are as well.
Yeah, and it's nice when you discover something. I mean, I know I messaged you before about particular
have.
tracks that you played that then introduced me to them,
Yeah.
and the likes of, gosh, I've forgotten the name now of the artist that you played, but there was a wonderful song that Mary Gaucher.
Oh, yes.
And I did not know her work at all, and
Yeah.
then a year or two later she turns up at Celtic Connections, and you know, we go off and see her.
Also
and,
a book writer, you might have her here at some
yeah,
point.
exactly. So it's one of those sort of great, I guess, moments of being able to share your knowledge.
Yeah, it's really great. It's a lovely thing to be involved in.
Back to Deacon Blue, and I suppose you could describe it in some ways as a sort of game of two halves. You've got the two stages of Deacon Blue. There's the part of it that I mentioned at first about Raintown and the early beginnings of the band. The band obviously came to a halt, and you talk about that in the book about why in 1994, and then you come back again.
Yeah. Well, and we took it. I mean, we did come back, and actually 5 years later we got back together, and then we sort of stayed together. But by that time, all of us had found different sort of careers. You know, Jim, our keyboard player, had become. Ewan had left. Graham, actually, at that time, was starting to be ill. He of course died in 2014. But he also had started doing other things. He was writing music for television. Jim had this big thing that he was wanting to do, was create a music school, and eventually taught in the music school down in the University of the West of Scotland. Dougie had immediately said, you know, well, if the band split up, I'm going to do something different, and had auditioned for a job. We talked about Brian Burnett. At the time, Brian was doing a programme called NB on Scottish television. So Dougie did an audition for that, and of course they snapped him up, and he's had a fantastic career in television. And Lorraine had met a guy called Ken Loach, and she never acted in her life, but that's how Ken Loach likes working with people. And she got a part in a movie. So she started a different thing, and I sort of battled on. I was probably the one that was the most lost, but fun enough, it'd been me that really had wanted to change. But we all started doing things for ourselves. So when we came back together, it was quite nice because we kept the things that we discovered. And then when we came together, it was like, this is great, because it's dead easy now, and we're much more grateful for it because we know what it's like out there in the real world. So that's been our thing, and even now, and you know, we still do a lot of stuff, but we've just put a new tour on sale last week, which had an incredible response. I've never had a response like it for next year, but. The nice thing is we also do our own thing, which I think means when we come together, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, because you talk about admiring bands like Simple Minds and other bands who have been there since, you know, way back in the sort of early 80s and are still going strong.
Yeah.
But surely there actually has been a benefit, I guess, to splitting Deacon Blue's career over that time. You came back together because you wanted to come back and you wanted to play rather than because you needed to do it.
I think so. I think we... and I think that, and sometimes it takes outside people, you know, sometimes people say things to you that's really, there's such obvious things that you can never quite say them to yourself. And I remember a friend of mine I used to write and program with a bass player that was working with us, and I said, well, I'm meant to be writing some songs for this next Deacon Blue record. How do I do that? Because I've forgotten how to do it. And he said, well, just go back to what you did at the beginning. And I said, but what is that? And I suddenly realized what he meant, what I took it was, just write the best song you can, and the band will find that if it's good, they'll do that. Don't try and write, you know, for the band. That's a bit daft. Just write the best thing you can. So that was good advice. We went through different managers. We'd had the same manager for a long, long time, and we had a kind of horrible time when we just couldn't find the right person. And we've become managed by a lovely, lovely guy who's become our best friend, a guy called Tom O'Rourke, who normally is with me in everything. Tom's father was the manager of Pink Floyd. And so Tom learned everything from his dad. And his dad's thing was, he went wherever the band went, he did it with them. So Tom is the same. It's very unusual for him not to be here. He's with me this morning. But yeah, so it's been a really, it's been a lovely time really getting back with the band.
How different does it feel now? Obviously, you've had that hiatus from the pandemic, having forced everything off the road again. But how different does it feel to those early days of Deacon Blue when you're back out there on the road again?
I think everyone's grown up a bit, I think that's part of it. And everyone's too, the thing is, as a singer, you can never really be that very rock and roll anyway, because we do long shows, I talk during the show, and so I've just got to sit quietly during the day and not say very much. So all of that's, you have to kind of wait for a night off, but I think it's calmed down a little bit. But there's, I think it's more gentle. I think it's just a little bit more gentle. And I think there was, when you're starting off in the early days, I think you are very ambitious. You don't just want to play the gig that night. You want to know what the gig is, and when am I going to do this, and when is the next record going to come out, and when can we release this? And you're so impatient. Whereas now I think you're a little bit kind of, you realise you're the custodian of something that is very special to people, and people have had a soundtrack and it's been part of their lives. So it's important to look after that and celebrate it. And one of the things I promised myself when we came back together was that every night when we do these sort of big songs like Dignity, I'm going to just take a minute and look around the room, because you don't know, you just don't know what's going to happen. And I think that's one of the things the pandemic really brought home to me, was you can never just fully know what's around the corner. So you have to celebrate and enjoy moments.
There's a lovely, just when you're talking about live performance, there's a lovely description towards the very end of the book, and since it's not a novel, I can safely read it out without spoiling it for you. But you talk about this sort of build up to a gig, then comes the gig, and suddenly it's all okay. Mistakes are brushed aside, and you can carry on right through to the end, because that's what you have to do. And somehow it's all brilliant. People love it, and you, for that brief 20 minutes, hour or 4 hours, fall back in love with each other, knowing it's only possible because they're all there, facing the same way, playing as much or as little as is needed, literally in concert. And I just thought that was a beautiful summary of live music. And you see so much about bands coming back again and maybe not recapturing that, but somehow with that, it just sounds like you recaptured everything that you had back there in the 80s. I
think one of the things about a band is it's a funny thing. You look at people like Mick Jagger, and he knows, and everyone else knows, the Mick Jagger solo albums, they're good, they're interesting, but they're not Rolling Stones albums. There's something about, and Deacon Blue is the same. I've just been doing some solo shows. People enjoy them, but it's not Deacon Blue. I cannot be that band without these people. And I know that getting these key people in the room makes us what we are. But individually, it's okay. But there's something about it to being together, and and I think when you can get that in once you realise that, it's quite a humbling experience, but it's also quite an enabling thing, because you realise actually we can do something that's much bigger than any of us individually.
With the solo shows, it is interesting, because I think the book and your latest CD are wonderful companion pieces. It's lovely to be able to read a book and listen to the music at the same time and kind of cross reference them. So it feels like there's a need for that as well. That you are as productive as ever when it comes to songwriting.
I've always loved. Funnily enough, because we're doing these solo shows, and Hannah White, who's been supporting me, and we're talking about this, I said, people probably don't realise how much, as songwriters, you love an audience that listens. And I know that sounds really an odd thing, but there's so many gigs where people are noisy, they take their phones out and they're going to the bar, all that kind of stuff. So to get an audience, play your songs, and they actually just listen to them, is actually a real treat. You were talking about Mary Gaucher. Mary said to me, She said, I come from New Orleans. New Orleans is a party town. No one wants to listen. So it's important to have, for singer-songwriters, to have a listening room. And so for me, to be able to make an album and do a tour where it's just that, you know, it's just about the songs, just about conversation. It's quite different from being a big, there's no big light show, there's no, you know, big PA, there's no big arrangements with the bands, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's a lovely contrast. And so you finish one thing, you think, oh, we've got to do the other one. So I finished the solo one, and I'm quite looking forward to the other one now.
Also, because so many of your songs have a narrative, there are stories. Yeah. You're a brilliant storyteller in song. And so, you know, even with a lot of the new songs, I had kind of questions about things, thinking I would really like to go and hear that, so that you then explain, you know, what happens. And it made me laugh at the beginning of the book when you explain that part of your reasoning for wanting to write this down was introducing songs in the past at fairly large venues, and people shout, "Get on with it!" and they just want to hear the song. Well, you know, not everybody just wants to hear the song. Quite a lot of people want to know the story. So it's just
exactly. It's just it's context, isn't it? It's just like finding a place in a little room and somewhere. Where you can do that, and sort of safe spaces in a funny kind of way, where you feel that you've got that trust from the audience that they will listen, but you know, you also need to be careful, because I think that I'm always aware that, you know, in solo shows you think, yeah, but 3 or 4 songs in, do something familiar, because they start to get restless, you know. So it's always good to have Wages Day up your pocket, you know, in the back pocket.
But I mean, they are stories. You see yourself with the albums, they are short stories.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, they are.
And so, I mean, I was thinking, just listening to them on the way across in the car, Only God and Dogs is one of my, I don't know, I can't even talk about it, it just makes me so sad. But also, A Gordon for Me. What a beautiful song. Can you explain the background to that one?
Gordon is Gordon Aikman. Gordon Aikman. One of the interesting things about 2014 during the referendum was that I was on the yes side, as people probably know that. But one of the lovely things that happened was that Gordon Aikman worked for Better Together. He was about 28 or 29 years old, and round about at the end of 2013, I think it happened, that he discovered he had motor neuron disease, which, as you know, is just a killer. It's just a terrible thing. So he went public about it, and he ended up writing a column in the Sunday Times, I think it was at the time. And a lot of people were doing the ice bucket challenge. You remember that whole thing for motor neuron disease? Even George W. Bush did it. And people were doing it, and I think people in Scotland were doing it because of Gordon. And it sort of bridged that kind of horrible thing that people thought was happening between the Better Together and the Yes campaign, all that kind of thing. And for some reason, I think I was doing the radio, and I maybe asked Gordon to come and talk about it. Anyway, he liked me, and he was going to get married to a guy called Joe Pike, who's you'll see on television. He's a Sky News reporter now. And Gordon phoned me up and said, "Could you sing at our wedding?" And I thought, yeah, you know, I could. I couldn't think of saying no, but I thought, oh, what's that going to be like, you know? So I sang at their wedding, which was the most intimidating gig I'd ever done, because I walked in, they got married in the assembly rooms in Edinburgh, and I thought it was all the people from the Better Together campaign that were in the room. And I thought, this is going to be the toughest audience I've ever played, you know. But they were really, really lovely, actually. They were very nice. And Blair McDougall, who was sort of the main guy from the thing, he was standing there as I went on. He kind of winked at me, and I thought, that's quite good. So I did that, and of course, Gordon's health deteriorated. We stayed in touch. And I was away somewhere, I can't remember where. I think I was away skiing with my son when he died, and I couldn't get to the funeral. And so I wanted to write something about this love that Joe and Gordon had, because it'd been the first, maybe the second gay wedding that I'd been at, but certainly, you know, first one I'd performed or I'd been part of, and it was really moving because of the circumstances. So I wrote the song for Joe, really, about the love that they had, and the kind of statements that they'd made, and the fact that, you know, even 10 years before that, these things wouldn't have happened. You know, I really feel strongly about this, that I also feel strongly as a Christian that the church has been so bad at vilifying and excluding people, you know, gay people. It's been wrong all the way along. And I felt honoured, you know, to be involved in their relationship. So I wanted to write the song for that. And I sent it to Joe, and I said, look, Joe, I'm not going to put this out unless you like it. So he did, which was good. Sorry, long explanation. The song's only about 2 minutes.
But it's a gorgeous song, and you know, like so many, you start saying, wonder what the story is behind that. Often when people write a memoir, they sort of spend so long going back. It's all about looking backwards, and you kind of almost can't get back into the momentum of going forwards again. It doesn't feel like that. From what you're saying, you sound just as inspired and just as busy writing songs and also touring at the moment.
I am, but I'm going to be 65 next month. I've got a grandson now, and there's times when I think actually it would be just nice to sort of enjoy life a bit more. But I've always been a sort of bit of a worrier about work. I've always been someone who goes, what we're doing, because when you're self-employed, you never quite know what's around the corner. So I'm not going to force myself to do things I don't want to do. And I stopped doing one of the radio shows that I did. I wasn't enjoying it as much for different reasons, and I stopped doing that. I'm still going to do my country show, but I'm kind of looking forward. I've just stopped the tour last night, and I'm looking forward to having a few months just to kind of maybe, wander around a bit.
And I suppose one of the joys of being a songwriter is quite often, you mentioned those brackets, quite often we might not necessarily know that it's one of your songs that has turned up somewhere. Are there quite a few of your songs out there? There's one or two. There's one or two.
I don't purposely write songs with other people at the moment because that's a whole other world, but I wouldn't talk about it. But the songwriting world has changed a lot. And if you check out any song that's currently in the charts, as they say, you'll find there's maybe somewhere upwards of 5 people involved in songwriting. And for me, 3 is quite busy. 5 is impossible, and some of them involve 10, and I think, no, I'm out.
I wonder if anybody in the audience has any questions for Ricky. We've got a roving microphone if anyone wanted to ask about the book or music or anything in particular.
Hi, Ricky. Thanks very much for that. That was great. Just maybe a kind of easy one, a two-parter maybe to kick off. One is, you touched on a wee bit about songwriting and sort of 35 years in, presumably hundreds of songs. How do you keep that fresh? How do you kind of, I don't know, use the muscle memory of all the previous ones or find new ways to explore that? And then the second part, which you touched on as well, do you think the music that you make is peculiarly Scottish?
Well, the second part, I'm not sure. I think it's almost easier for others to judge that. Sometimes you get that sense, if you do an interview with someone in Australia or something, you guys and you guys and you guys, I can hear the sort of common threads. And maybe there is that thing. I think I don't worry this. I used to worry because you think you've done all the things that you've played all the chords that you could possibly play. I actually one of the things I love about country music is they are not scared to still write 3-chord songs. In fact, sometimes 2-chord songs. Someone like Van Morrison, I really admire the fact that they stick within that format and they find new ways. So actually listening to country music has reawakened something in me. And if you listen to someone like Springsteen as well, he's never scared of just going back into that 3-chord structure. Harlan, I'll probably tell you something you all know, but there's a great quote in the Country Music Hall of Fame, and it's by Harlan Howard. It's country music's 3 chords and the truth. And there is something about that that's still there. And so going back into the kind of building bricks of songs in the same way as you started is not to be feared. I think it's something to be encouraged.
Thanks a lot, both. I was just interested to know the extent to which your kind of sense of God has influenced your lyrics over the years.
A sense of God?
God, yeah. Not necessarily faith, but your own kind of sense of God.
Well, it's, over the last probably 20 years, I kind of got to know, and he was a big influence on me, was Richard Holloway. And Richard's, we also did the same radio program, so we kind of knew each other that way. And Richard's an interesting character. But Richard always says, Richard's great phrase is, the opposite of faith isn't doubt, the opposite of faith is certainty. And I think that's one of the things that has helped me with faith, because if you're someone, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or whatever, or even if you're an atheist, it's not like you wake up in the morning and think the same thing as you thought, 3 weeks ago or even yesterday. And sometimes, certainly, I remember when my father died in the mid-90s, I had this absence of God, absolutely, sense of which really floored me. I didn't expect that. And I remember walking up the Royal Mile with my wife, telling her this, and she said, right, you, into that pub, we need to talk about this. So it was quite interesting that, I've had that. I think if anyone has a deep sense of faith or of God, I think you also have a sense, and you can see that if you read the Bible, you can see it. The prophets had it, the disciples had it. They ran out on Jesus. So I think there's always that sense in which you're struggling with these things. If you have faith. So that's been my experience of that. I don't know if that's helpful for you.
And you talk about that in the book as well, don't you? That the places that takes you, the connections that it makes. And in particular, when you go to perform in Come On at Prison, I was there at that point. We went,
you were,
came along for that too. And also just when you're going abroad as well, these are connections that are made through various people who are listening to their faith.
Yeah, and going to certainly for me going to the. And Lorraine we went together to the DRC, which I talk about here, and Rwanda. These are places where, sometimes it's easy to talk about faith here, because it's like an add-on. It's like, you're in the bowling club, and and you like pop music, and you like Strictly Come Dancing. Oh, by the way, go to church on Sunday. But for them, faith was asking huge questions, forgiveness when in the most horrible circumstances. So, that kind of thing has been really eye-opening. And one of the lovely things that came out of doing the radio thing on a Sunday morning for me was this kind of network of friends that I've got. So the other week I had coffee in Cafe Gandolfi with my friend Rabbi Judy. She's a rabbi. She's a liberal rabbi from London. She was up doing a wedding, and she said, "Can we meet up?" And so I've managed to keep this kind of little community of people of faith that I think are just great folk to have conversations with.
It must be true of your other radio shows as well. I'm just thinking even all the kind of country connections that you've made, the going from that person who knew so little about country music but just wanted to immerse in it, you are now one of the best connected people there.
But don't confuse me with anyone that knows anything about it, because there's so much to know.
But you know what you like. And that's
I know what I like, and I know the people to ask.
And that's the important part of it, isn't
it?
Were there any other questions? There's one up the back, I think.
Thank you, Ricky. It's been really wonderful listening to you, because you are a storyteller, and that came across. But I'd like to ask you, when you're writing a song, what comes first, the words or the music?
Well, years ago, I realised that one of the things that was probably good was to just break up. My modus operandi was always to sit down at the piano, see what happened, and then start, And I remember interviewing Sean Colvin, who's a really interesting. Sean Colvin's own story is a really great story. She had real mental health problems, but she was very honest about her songwriting. She would say she wrote with a guy called John Leventhal, and he would send her backing tracks, and she would just go and sing anything that came out of her head. And I said, that's so funny. I said, I often feel quite ashamed about that, but that's, funnily enough, it's one that a lot of songwriters will say that. Sometimes you sing the first thing that comes into your mind, and you go, well, what did we just, wind that tape back, what did we just say there? So sometimes that's how it starts. Other times, for example, with probably my most famous song, Dignity, I brought the lyric back from a holiday, and it sat there for a while, and eventually put music to it. So sometimes it's a bit of both. And sometimes, for lots and lots of songs, I have these titles that I think, that's good, but what are we going to do with that? And the title, for example, I had on my desktop the two words, the hipsters, and it just used to make me laugh, because I thought that's a least likely description of us as a band. And then I kind of wanted to really write a song about the fact that we weren't, but it became an album title. So.
And do you still have a big list of these?
Oh yeah, I
songs?
haven't got my phone with me, but
you've got a pile of them.
Yeah.
And do you every so often just go back and think, right, I'm going to set this to music?
Oh, just sometimes you're with other people. I mean, I've done a lot of co-writing, and people say, "What have you got?" And I've started doing a thing which I love. I'd started doing on Eastbourne Esplanade the other week, because I was playing a gig there, and walking. If you walk past people at a certain speed, you only always hear about one sentence that they've got, and so I started writing them down. I thought, so that might become a thing as well.
And when you talk about the people with the people that like to be in the brackets, who are the songwriters that you admire most?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, people that I've worked with, for example, Egg White, who's a beautiful songwriter, and we've written a couple of things together. We wrote a song that Will Young covered, and Egg himself wrote Leave Right Now for Will Young, and Chasing Pavements for Adele. I mean, beautifully constructed songs. So he's a London-based songwriter. And then currently, you know, gosh, so many. I mean, we became obsessed with Self-Esteem and her album and her whole thing. You know, Lorraine, I sort of pointed her out to Lorraine when she was on playing at Glastonbury, and that's become a kind of really thing, because it's a completely different style of songwriting. And then people like Jason Isbell, who's almost like the kind of new, I suppose for this generation, maybe the more authentic kind of Springsteen for them. So many, and so many young female songwriters that come through. I went to see Anais Mitchell, and Anais is a brilliant songwriter, but again, is going back to that thing, almost within these three chords. Of course, she's written an amazing musical called Hadestown. It started off as a college musical, ended up on Broadway, and has won Tony Awards, running on Broadway at the moment. She was playing at St. Luke's just a couple of weeks ago, you know, just a wee gig, but fantastic.
And then also you've always been quite good at sort of bringing people to attention. So someone like Burt Bacharach, which maybe at the point that you released that album of songs, maybe there would be some people that would think he was a bit of a cheesy, you know, past note, but actually there's a great songwriter.
Oh, amazing songwriter. Yeah, amazing songwriter. And of course he wrote a lovely EP recently with Daniel Tashin, Daniel Tashin is who wrote a lot of songs for the amazing album by Casey Musgraves, Golden Hour, which is just a fantastic album. Even if you don't like country music, it really is a great album. And they worked together. And but I think one of the things that it wasn't an album, it was just an EP, but that we did. But because we said songs by Bacharach and David, and I think if anyone's really honest, the real golden catalogue of Burt Bacharach is with Hal David, and Hal David wrote me a lovely letter when I'll Never Fall in Love Again became a hit, and it was a real treasure. I've still got it. And then when he was 90, ASCAP asked, we did a celebration of Hal's life in London, and I played I'll Never Fall in Love Again for him that night. So it was, and he actually died a few months later, but what a lovely man. But I think he loved the fact that we mentioned it wasn't just Burt Bacharach, it was Burt and Hal. You know?
He is the ultimate name in brackets, really, isn't he?
Yes, absolutely.
He definitely is. I think we've only got a minute left. I don't know if anybody... we've got one more question here. I didn't want to miss out anyone that had a question for you.
Ricky, I'm hoping you can solve a mystery for me. I grew up in the south side and in Ibrox area, and not far from there, Paisley Road toll. I used to go past as a teenager with lots of people dressed in Stetsons, leather boots and the like. Grand Old Opry, or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
What's the difference between that subculture 40, 50 years ago and country music in this country now?
Well, I mean, I think people have a good time there. They go there and do their stuff. But, you know, I'm not sure that's entirely music driven, you know. And I don't want to disparage it, because, you know, it's just what it is, you know. People, and it's like any group of people, they're having a lot of fun together and they're doing shootouts and all that kind of thing. But, yeah, I think country music is very vibrant. I wouldn't always agree that, you know, like, Bob Harris is a good friend, and I really love Bob very much. But I think what, like, Radio 2 classify even as country, sometimes is a little bit narrow as well. It's a bit pop country. But I think that going back to that RAB definition, which is places, music where country music's made its presence felt, that's interesting for me, because then you get the Louvin Brothers. Without the Louvin Brothers, you'd never had the Beatles. You know, it goes on and goes on. So I think that the answer to your question is that there's lots of really great stuff out there, but sometimes you've got to dig a little bit harder than just Paisley. Paisley Road West, anyway.
So you're not going later then?
No.
Just to let you know, Ricky will be signing copies of the book up in the library after this event, and also I don't think you have any copies of the CD or however you get your music these days, but recommended as well as listening alongside the book, so do check that out. And meantime, just want to say thank you very much to Ricky Ross.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.